The temple of Asclepius stood at the edge of the Palatine Hill, its marble columns gleaming white against the deepening twilight of Rome. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning myrrh, and the sharper, more acrid smell of illness, sweat and blood, and the peculiar sweetness of approaching death. Aelia moved through the rows of sick and dying with practiced efficiency, her hands steady as she administered tinctures and changed bandages, her voice soft with words of comfort that she had long since stopped believing herself. She had been born under an ill-omened star, or so the midwife had told her mother. The birth had been difficult, lasting 3 days and 3 nights, and when Aelia finally emerged into the world, the midwife had taken one look at her and declared that the gods had marked her. Not with any visible sign, her body was perfect, unblemished, beautiful even, but the mark was there nonetheless, written in her very essence, a curse that would define her entire life. Aelia could not bear children. It was not a matter of choice or circumstance. Her body simply could not, sustain life within it. She had known this truth before she was old enough to understand what it meant, had felt it in her bones like a winter chill that never quite left. The priest said it was balance, that the gods had given her the gift of healing in exchange for the ability to create life. She would spend her existence preserving the lives of others, they explained, but would never know the joy of bringing her own child into the world. Aelia called it punishment. At 30 years old, she had long since accepted her fate. She had never married, despite offers from respectable men who saw in her a skilled physician and a woman of good family. What man wanted a wife who could not give him heirs? What purpose did a woman serve if not to continue the family line? So Aelia had devoted herself entirely to her craft, becoming one of the most sought-after healers in Rome, her reputation spreading through the city like wildflower in spring. But reputation brought no warmth on cold nights, no comfort when the loneliness pressed down like a physical weight. She had saved hundreds of lives, perhaps thousands, yet could not create even one. The irony was not lost on her. Tonight, the temple was filled beyond capacity. The plague had come to Rome 3 weeks ago, carried by ships from the east, spreading through the crowded insulae like fire through dry grass. The poor died by the dozens, their bodies carted away each morning to be burned outside the city walls. The rich retreated to their country villas and prayed to their household gods, and healers like Aelia worked until their hands bled and their eyes could no longer focus, trying desperately to stem a tide that seemed unstoppable. "Mistress Aelia," called one of the temple attendants, a young man named Marcus whose face was pale with exhaustion. "There is a man at the entrance. He refuses to leave until he speaks with you." Aelia looked up from the fever-racked child she was tending, annoyance flashing through her. "Tell him to wait. I have patients who need—" "I told him, mistress, but he says it is urgent. He says—" Marcus hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He says he knows about your curse." The word sent ice through Aelia's veins. She stood slowly, wiping her hands on a cloth stained rust-red with blood. "Where is he?" "At the temple entrance. He will not come inside. He says the sacred ground burns him." Burns him. Aelia's mind raced through possibilities. A leper, perhaps, whose diseased skin was sensitive to the blessed oils the priests used. A madman touched by divine frenzy. Or something else entirely. Something the rational part of her mind refused to acknowledge. She made her way through the crowded temple, stepping carefully around pallets where the sick lay moaning or silent, past braziers where offerings burned to the god of healing, until she reached the great bronze doors that opened onto the street. Outside, Rome sprawled in the darkness, a vast city of marble and stone, of triumph and tragedy, of life and death intertwined like lovers. And standing just beyond the threshold of sacred ground, so still he might have been carved from shadow itself, was a man. He was tall, taller than any Roman she had ever seen, with shoulders that spoke of warrior's training, and a bearing that suggested nobility. His face was beautiful in the way that cold marble statues are beautiful, perfect features that somehow lacked warmth, skin so pale it seemed to drink in the moonlight rather than reflect it. He wore a cloak of deepest black that seemed to absorb light, and beneath it she caught glimpses of clothing that spoke of wealth and taste, though the style was oddly archaic, reminiscent of fashions from a century past. But it was his eyes that captured her attention and held it. Even in the dim light of the street torches, they gleamed with an inner fire, not the warm gold of lamplight, but something colder, more predatory. Red, she realized with a chill. His eyes were red. "You are Alia," he said, and his voice was like winter wind through bare branches, beautiful and terrible and utterly inhuman. The healer who cannot heal herself. Alia's hand moved instinctively to the small knife she kept at her belt, hidden beneath her stola. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man smiled, and she saw the briefest flash of something sharp and white. "My name is Lucan, and I want nothing from you, physician. I come only to offer something you have never had. A choice." "A choice about what?" Alia demanded, though part of her wanted to turn and flee back into the safety of the temple, to the familiar world of blood and herbs and dying mortals. "About your curse," Lucan said simply. "About your future. About whether you will continue to heal the dying while your own soul withers, or whether you will accept a different kind of life, one where death is not an ending but a beginning." He took a single step forward, and Alia saw that he stopped precisely at the boundary where sacred ground met the common street, as if an invisible wall prevented him from coming closer. "I know what you are," she said quietly. "The priests speak of your kind in whispers. The immortali, blood drinkers, creatures of the night who prey on the living. We have many names," Lucan agreed. "Most of them earned. But I do not come to prey on you, Alia. I come because I have watched you for 3 nights, seen how you pour yourself into saving lives that will flicker out regardless, how you give everything and receive nothing in return. I come because I see in you what I once was, a healer of sorts, though my healing was done with words and laws rather than herbs and bandages. And I come because the gods who cursed you are the same gods who cursed me, and perhaps together we might find a way to transform that curse into something resembling grace." Alia stared at him, her mind warring with itself. Every rational thought screamed at her to dismiss this madness, to return to her patience, to forget this strange pale man with his crimson eyes and his impossible words. But beneath the rationality, beneath the years of discipline and denial, something stirred, a desperate hope she had thought long dead. "Why me?" she whispered. "Of all the people in Rome, all the healers and physicians, why approach me?" Lucan's smile softened, becoming almost sad. "Because you, like me, know what it means to be unable to create life. Because you understand that immortality is not a gift, but a burden, that living forever while watching everything you love turn to dust is its own kind of death. And because—" He paused, and for the first time, something almost human flickered in those terrible red eyes. "Because in 700 years of darkness I have never met anyone whose soul burned as brightly as yours. You are surrounded by death, yet you refuse to let it consume you. You have every reason to become bitter and cruel, yet you remain gentle. That is rarer than you know, rarer than gold, rarer than empire. And I thought, perhaps, you might understand." The night wind blew cold between them, carrying the smell of smoke from the funeral pyres beyond the city walls, the distant sound of mourning, the eternal song of Rome, triumph and tragedy, always together, always inseparable. Inside the temple, someone cried out in pain. Marcus appeared at her shoulder. "Mistress, the child is worsening. We need you." Alia looked back at the dying child, then at the impossible man who stood beyond the threshold of sacred ground, offering her choices she had never dared to imagine. "I must go," she said. "My patients need me. They will always need you," Lucan replied softly. "The question is whether you will have anything left to give after they have taken everything. Think on what I have said, Alia. I will return tomorrow night, and the night after. I will return until you make your choice, to continue as you are, or to step beyond the boundary of mortality and discover what eternity might hold." He bowed slightly, a gesture of such perfect courtly grace that it seemed to belong to another age entirely, then turned and walked into the shadows. Within 3 steps, the darkness had swallowed him completely, as if he had never existed at all. Alia stood frozen for a long moment, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. Then Marcus called again, more urgently, and she forced herself to turn away, to return to the world she knew, to the dying and the desperate who needed her hands and her knowledge. But as she worked through the long night, cleaning wounds and mixing medicines, holding the hands of those who slipped away despite her best efforts, she could not stop thinking about crimson eyes and impossible offers, about curses and choices, and the terrible weight of living while unable to create life. And when dawn finally broke over Rome, painting the marble temples in shades of rose and gold, Aelia realized that something fundamental had shifted within her. The stranger had opened a door she had not known existed, and now she could not help but wonder what might lie on the other side. Lucan returned the following night, as promised, appearing at the temple entrance just as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars began their vigil over Rome. Aelia had told herself she would not seek him out, would not acknowledge his presence, would simply continue her work as she always had. But when Marcus informed her of the stranger's return, she found her feet carrying her to the bronze doors before her mind could form an objection. He stood in the same place, just beyond the sacred boundary, looking exactly as he had the night before, as if time itself had no claim on him. Tonight, however, she saw him more clearly. The archaic style of his clothing was not merely old-fashioned but ancient, the cut and drape of his toga speaking of an era long past. And there was something about his bearing, the way he held himself, that spoke of command, of absolute authority worn so naturally it had become part of his very essence. "You came," he said simply. "You knew I would," Aelia replied, stopping at the threshold. "You knew curiosity would compel me, even if wisdom counseled otherwise. Curiosity is the beginning of all transformation," Lucan observed. He gestured to the street behind him. "Walk with me. I promise you will be perfectly safe. Your patience can spare you for a few hours." Aelia hesitated, every instinct warning her against leaving the temple's protection. But the same desperate hope that had stirred the night before now bloomed fully in her chest, overwhelming caution. She stepped across the threshold. They moved through Rome's night streets in silence, passing torchlit taverns where laughter spilled into darkness, elegant homes where wealthy families dined behind guarded doors, and shadowed alleyways where the desperate conducted their business. Lucan moved through it all with perfect ease, his presence causing people to unconsciously step aside, even though most seemed unable to perceive him clearly. "You said you were a healer once," Aelia finally said as they entered the forum, that great heart of Roman power now mostly empty in the night. "You spoke of words and laws. What did you mean?" Lucan stopped before the ruins of an ancient temple, one so old that most Romans had forgotten which god it had honored. He ran his pale hand along the weathered stone, his expression distant. "I was emperor once," he said quietly. "Long ago, before the current dynasty, before the great fires and the civil wars. I ruled Rome at the height of her power. I believed then that law could heal the wounds of society, that justice properly administered could cure the sickness in men's souls." He laughed, a sound without humor. "I was young, foolish. I thought I could make Rome into something more than an empire built on conquest and blood. I freed slaves, reformed the courts, protected the weak from the powerful." His hand curled into a fist against the stone. "I was naive." Aelia listened, fascinated despite herself. The history he spoke of matched no records she knew, yet something in his voice carried the weight of absolute truth. "The Senate conspired against me," Lucan continued. "The patricians whose power I had curtailed, the generals whose wars I had ended. They invited me to a feast. I went, believing in their goodwill." He turned to face her, and in the moonlight, his beautiful, terrible face seemed carved from pain itself. "They poisoned me, but not with any ordinary poison. They had consulted with priests of the old gods, the dark ones whose names are no longer spoken. They wanted me not just dead, but damned. The gods cursed you," Aelia whispered, understanding dawning. "The gods transformed me," Lucan corrected. "I died that night, my body broken and bleeding while men I had called friends stood watching. But I did not stay dead. I rose 3 days later in the tomb where they had sealed me, and I was changed. The sunlight that had once warmed my skin now burned like fire. The food and wine I had savored turned to ash in my mouth, and the blood of the living." He paused, his eyes closing briefly. "The blood of the living sang to me like nothing ever had before." He opened his eyes and looked directly at her. "I was cursed to walk in darkness, to feed on the living, to watch century after century pass while I remained unchanged. But more than that, I was cursed to remember what it felt like to be human, to love and hope and dream, to remember my wife's face, though she has been dust for 700 years. That is the true curse, physician. Not the darkness or the blood or the endless years, but the memory of everything you have lost and can never reclaim." Aelia felt tears prick her eyes, moved by the profound sorrow in his voice. "Then why continue? Why not simply walk into the sun and end it?" "Because hope is more stubborn than despair," Lucan said softly. Because every century I tell myself that perhaps this time I will find something, someone, who makes the darkness bearable. I have spent 7 centuries searching for mortals whose souls shine brightly enough to pierce my darkness. I offer them what I can, companionship for their brief years, and in return they remind me what it means to be alive. And after they die? Aelia asked. I mourn them, Lucan said simply. I remember them. I carry them with me into the endless night. They reached the Tiber's edge, where the water flowed black and silver under the moon. Lucan turned to face her fully. But you are different, Aelia. The others I have chosen were complete in themselves. They had lived full lives, known love and joy. You have known none of those things. You have been denied them by the same gods who denied them to me. And I thought, he hesitated, I thought perhaps you might understand what it means to live half a life, to be cursed with abilities but denied fulfillment. You said my soul burns brightly, Aelia said, but I feel only darkness. I heal bodies while my own spirit withers. What brightness is there in that? The brightness of refusing to surrender, Lucan replied. You could have become bitter, Aelia. You could have turned away from healing, decided that if you cannot create life, you will not preserve it either. But you did not. You choose every day to give everything you have. That is what makes you extraordinary. He held his hand near her face, not touching but feeling the warmth that radiated from her living flesh. I told you I would offer you a choice. Here it is. Continue as you are. Live your mortal span. Die knowing you helped many, but never knowing the joy of creation. Or accept my gift. Become like me. Trade your mortality for eternity. Your ability to heal for freedom from death. You will never bear children, but you will also never grow old, never sicken, never face the grave. I would have to drink blood, Aelia said, her voice barely above a whisper. You would have to feed, Lucan corrected. But killing is not necessary. I have not killed in 300 years. There are ways. Criminals condemned to execution, the dying who welcome release. It is not easy, and the hunger is always there, but it can be managed. I can teach you. Aelia looked out at the dark water, her mind churning with impossible thoughts. Everything she believed argued against what he offered. Yet the curse she had carried since birth whispered that perhaps this was the answer she had never dared to seek. Why do you want me? She asked. Truly. Lucan was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. In 700 years, none of them truly understood what it means to be cursed by the gods, while everyone speaks of blessing. You understand that, Aelia. You live it every day, and I thought perhaps if I could transform your curse into something else, could give you a different kind of eternity, perhaps I could finally believe that curses are not permanent, that even the gods' judgment can be transcended. He turned away from the river. I am not asking you to decide tonight. Take time. Think. When you are ready, you will give me your answer. But know this. Whatever you choose, I will honor it. If you say no, I will leave Rome and trouble you no more. But if you say yes, I will give you eternity. And perhaps in doing so, I will finally find peace in my own. He walked away, leaving Aelia standing alone by the dark river with a choice that would define the rest of her existence. For 3 nights, Aelia watched him. Lucan came to the temple each evening as promised, never crossing the sacred threshold, never demanding her attention, simply standing in the shadows like a patient sentinel. And each night after her work was done, Aelia would join him, and they would walk through Rome's darkened streets, while he showed her what it meant to be immortale. The first night, he took her to the gladiatorial games. They stood in the shadows beneath the great amphitheater, listening to the roar of the crowd above as men killed and died for entertainment. When the games ended and the bodies were carted away, Lucan led her to the chambers beneath where the dead were prepared for burial. Watch, he said quietly, and approached one of the fallen gladiators, a young man whose throat had been opened by his opponent's sword. Lucan knelt beside the corpse, whispered words Aelia could not hear, then pressed his mouth to the wound. She expected to feel revulsion, horror. Instead, she felt only curiosity and a strange, detached understanding. The man was already dead. His blood would simply be wasted otherwise. When Lucan stood, his eyes glowed brighter for a moment, and some of the deathly pallor had left his face. The newly dead, he explained. Their blood still carries warmth, still remembers life. It sustains me without requiring me to kill. The second night, he showed her a criminal's execution, a murderer condemned by the courts, strangled in the Tullianum prison. Lucan had arranged to be present. had paid the guards for access. He chose his fate, Lucan said as the man's struggles ceased. His blood is forfeit by law. I simply ensure it serves a purpose. The third night, he took her to a brothel in the Subura. There he showed her another method, willing donors who offered their blood in exchange for gold. Some seek coin, he explained as a young woman bared her wrist. Others seek the sensation. My bite carries venom that brings euphoria. They return willingly, and I take only what they can spare. Alia watched it all, noting how careful he was, how controlled. He never took too much, never left his donors weakened. This was not the mindless monster of legend, but something far more complex. A predator bound by his own moral code, trying desperately to retain his humanity despite the curse that had stripped it away. On the fourth night, as they sat together on the steps of the Temple of Saturn overlooking the Forum, Alia finally spoke the question burning in her mind. If I accept your offer, what exactly would that mean? What would I lose? And what would I gain? Lucan was silent for a moment, choosing his words carefully. You would lose the sun. Daylight would become your enemy, burning your skin, blinding your eyes. You would have to learn to live in shadow. You would lose the simple pleasures of mortal life. Food would taste of ash, wine would turn bitter. Your body would no longer age, no longer sicken, but it would also no longer be truly alive in the way you understand now. He turned to look at her, his red eyes reflecting torchlight from the Forum below. You would lose your ability to heal. The touch that now mends wounds would become cold, lifeless. Whatever gift the gods gave you in exchange for your fertility would be forfeit. You would trade one curse for another. And what would I gain? Alia asked. Time, Lucan said simply. Endless time to learn, to grow, to become more than you are. Strength beyond mortal limits. Senses that perceive what others cannot. Freedom from disease, from aging, from decay. And you would gain me. My companionship, my protection, my knowledge of 7 centuries. You would not face eternity alone. Alia looked out over the Forum, at temples and monuments built by men long dead. You speak of time as a gift, but is it truly, or is it simply a longer sentence? That depends entirely on how you choose to use it, Lucan replied. For some of my kind, eternity becomes a prison. They grow bored, jaded, lose all capacity for wonder. They become true monsters. But others find ways to make the darkness bearable. They collect knowledge, create art, involve themselves in history's great movements. They find mortals to love, knowing that love will be brief, but choosing to embrace it anyway. Which are you? Alia asked. Lucan laughed, a sound of genuine amusement. I am somewhere between. I have lived long enough to grow weary of existence, yet not so long that I have lost all hope. I have been monster and saint and everything between. I am, after 700 years, still trying to understand what I am meant to be. He stood and offered her his hand. Come, there is one more thing I must show you. Alia took his hand. The first time she had touched him directly, and was startled by how cold his flesh was, like marble that had never known sun. He led her through winding streets to the Palatine Hill, to the ruins of an ancient palace. Inside, in a chamber lit only by moonlight, he showed her his resting place. It was a stone sarcophagus, ancient and weathered, with carvings worn nearly smooth. This was my tomb, Lucan explained. When I rose 3 days after my death, I discovered I could not bear to be far from it. Some binding of the curse ties me to this place. Every dawn, I must return here to sleep, and every dusk, I wake to face another night. It is both prison and sanctuary. He ran his hand along the stone lid. If you accept my gift, you too will need such a place. Somewhere dark and protected, where the sun cannot reach you. It will become both your refuge and your cage. Alia stared at the sarcophagus, imagining herself sealed within stone each day. How did you bear it? In the beginning, when everything you knew was gone, how did you find the will to continue? Lucan's expression became distant. Poorly. The first century was dark. I raged against the gods, against fate itself. I killed indiscriminately. I became the very thing the Senate had feared. He turned to face her. But slowly, I began to remember who I had been, the emperor who had tried to bring justice to Rome. And I realized that my curse did not have to define me, that I could choose who to be regardless of what I had become. And you think I can do the same? Alia asked. I think you already have, Lucan replied. You were cursed from birth, denied the one thing women are told defines their worth. Yet you transformed that curse into healing, into service. You took what the gods meant as punishment and made it into purpose. If anyone can transcend a curse, it is you. He stepped closer, his beautiful, terrible face both invitation and warning. I offer you this choice one final time, Aelia. Remain mortal. Live your brief span. Die knowing you served well. Or accept my blood. Become immortali, and discover what eternity might hold. But understand, this choice is irrevocable. Once made, it cannot be unmade. You whispered that you cannot bear children. If you accept my gift, you will bear my eternity instead. Aelia stood in the ruined palace, surrounded by ghosts of Rome's past, facing a choice that transcended everything she had ever known. She thought of her patients, dying despite her best efforts. She thought of the emptiness that had haunted her entire life. She thought of endless nights and endless years, of blood and darkness and immortal loneliness. And then she thought of the alternative, growing old, dying alone, never knowing anything beyond the curse she had carried since birth. When? She asked simply. When would you do it? Lucan's eyes widened slightly. You accept? I accept, Aelia said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. I have spent 30 years healing others while unable to heal myself. Perhaps it is time to try a different kind of existence. Lucan smiled then, genuine and warm despite his cold flesh. Then we will wait for the right moment. The transformation is violent and painful. You will need to be somewhere safe, somewhere I can protect you while your body dies and is reborn. He took her hand again. But know this, Aelia. Once it is done, you will never be alone again. Whatever eternity holds, we will face it together. The moment came 2 weeks later, on a night when the moon rose blood-red over Rome, and the streets ran with more than celestial portent. Rebellion had been brewing in the city for months, fed by bread shortages and the emperor's increasing taxation to fund his foreign wars. The poor suffered while the Senate feasted, and resentment festered like an untended wound. Aelia had felt the tension building in her patience, the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, the defiant looks in eyes that had once shown only resignation, the way young men flexed their hands as if already gripping weapons. The uprising began at sunset, just as Lucan arrived at the temple. Aelia heard it first as distant shouting, then as the crash of breaking pottery and the roar of an angry mob. Within minutes, the streets around the temple filled with rioters armed with clubs and torches, their fury finally unleashed after years of oppression. We need to leave, Lucan said urgently, appearing at her side inside the temple. For the first time since she had met him, he had crossed the sacred threshold, the desperate circumstances overriding whatever force had kept him out before. The mob will burn everything. The temples, the homes of the wealthy, anything that represents Rome's power. But Aelia was already moving among her patients, trying to evacuate those who could walk, calling for Marcus and the other attendants to help carry those who could not. I will not abandon them, she said firmly. These people came here for healing, for sanctuary. I cannot simply leave them to burn. Then I will help you, Lucan replied, and together they began the desperate work of moving the sick and dying from the temple. They had evacuated perhaps half the patients when the mob reached the temple steps. Aelia saw them through the bronze doors, dozens of men and women, their faces twisted with rage, their torches held high. At their head was a man she recognized, a laborer whose daughter she had treated for fever just days ago. "The temple must burn," he shouted, and the crowd roared its approval. "The priests grow fat while our children starve. Burn it. Burn it all. Please." Aelia stepped into the doorway, placing herself between the mob and her patients. "There are sick people inside, people who have done nothing to harm you. Whatever grievances you have with Rome, with the Senate, with the gods themselves, these innocent people do not deserve to die for them." For a moment she thought her words might reach them. That reason might prevail over rage. Then someone threw a stone. It struck her temple and she felt warm blood run down the side of her face. The world tilted and she stumbled backward. "Aelia!" Lucan was beside her instantly, catching her before she fell. His eyes blazed crimson in the torchlight and she saw his lips pull back to reveal fangs that had not been visible before. The crowd faltered, some primal instinct warning them that they faced something far more dangerous than a simple healer and her companion. But fear transformed into fury, as it always does with mobs. More stones flew, then a torch, arcing through the air to land inside the temple where it ignited the oil lamps used for offerings. Flames spread quickly across the wooden furnishings, and smoke began to fill the sacred space. "Get the patients out," Aelia commanded Marcus, pressing her hand to her bleeding temple. "Through the back entrance, into the catacombs. Go!" Marcus and the other attendants obeyed, leading the frightened patients deeper into the temple complex, toward the underground passages that connected to the Christian catacombs beneath the city. Aelia turned to follow, but another stone struck her, this one hitting her shoulder, then another finding her back. She fell to her knees, and the mob surged forward, sensing victory. Then an arrow, loosed from somewhere in the chaos, found its mark. Aelia felt it strike between her ribs, felt the sharp burning pain that spoke of punctured lung, felt the warm rush of blood that meant death would come quickly. She collapsed fully, her vision already darkening at the edges. The last thing she saw before consciousness fled was Lucan's face, transformed by fury into something truly monstrous as he scattered the mob like leaves before a storm. Then strong, cold arms lifted her, and the world dissolved into darkness and pain. She woke to agony in the catacombs beneath Rome, in a chamber lit only by a single lamp. Lucan knelt beside her, his face pale even by his standards, his hands covered in her blood. The arrow had been removed, but the wound gaped open, each breath bubbling wetly with blood. "I am dying," Aelia whispered, and was surprised by how calm she felt. Perhaps this was always how it was meant to end, the healer who could save others but not herself, dying in the dark beneath the city she had served. "Not if you choose otherwise," Lucan said, his voice tight with emotion. "The transformation, I can give it to you now. My blood can save you, can make you immortal. But you must choose, Aelia, and you must choose quickly. In minutes, you will be beyond even my ability to help." Above them, the sounds of riot continued. Screaming, breaking glass, the roar of flames consuming Rome's temples and monuments. The city was tearing itself apart, and Aelia was dying in its foundations. Faced with the choice she had agreed to, but never expected to make under such circumstances. "Will it hurt?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes," Lucan said honestly. "Your body must die before it can be reborn. Every organ will shut down, every nerve will scream. It will be the worst pain you have ever known, and it will last for hours. But at the end of it, if you survive, if your will is strong enough to cling to existence through the transformation, you will rise as I did, immortal, eternal, beyond death." Aelia looked down at her wound, at the blood pooling beneath her, at the life draining away with each weakening heartbeat. She thought of all the patients she had saved, all the lives preserved by her skill and dedication. She thought of the curse she had carried since birth, the children she would never bear, the emptiness that had defined her mortal existence. And she thought of Lucan, standing at the threshold of sacred ground, night after night, waiting with the patience of centuries for her to make her choice. "Do it," she said, her voice barely audible. "I choose eternity." Lucan closed his eyes briefly, something like relief crossing his features. Then he bent to his own wrist, and she watched as his fangs extended fully, watched as he tore open his own flesh. Dark blood welled up, almost black in the lamplight, carrying with it a scent that was simultaneously repulsive and intoxicating. "Drink," he commanded, pressing his wrist to her lips. "Drink deeply, and do not stop until I tell you." The blood touched her tongue, and Aelia's world exploded into sensation. It was nothing like the wine or water she had tasted in life. This was liquid fire and ice together, power and darkness concentrated into physical form. It burned as it went down, searing her throat, filling her dying body with a cold that was somehow more terrible than any heat. Her wound began to close, the torn flesh knitting together in a way that defied everything she knew about healing. But the pain did not lessen. Instead, it intensified, spreading from the wound throughout her entire body. Every nerve caught fire, every muscle spasmed, every bone felt as if it were breaking and reforming. "That is enough," Lucan said, pulling his wrist away despite her unconscious attempt to follow it. "Now comes the hard part. Your body must die so that it can be reborn. Do not fight it, Aelia. Let death take you, and then choose to return." He laid her gently on the stone floor of the catacomb, and Aelia felt her heart begin to slow. Each beat came further apart, weaker, like a drum growing distant. Her vision darkened, her breath rattled in her chest, and she felt herself slipping away into a darkness that had nothing to do with the unlit chamber. This was death, real and absolute. She was dying, but even as her mortal life fled, something else took root in her flesh. Lucan's blood, his curse, his immortality. It spread through her veins like poison and salvation together, killing what she had been while simultaneously creating what she would become. The last thing Aelia heard before death claimed her completely was Lucan's voice, speaking words that might have been prayer or command. Come back to me. Choose life. Choose eternity. Come back. Then there was nothing but darkness, and in that darkness Aelia of Rome died while something new and terrible and magnificent prepared to be born. Death was not darkness, Aelia discovered. It was everything and nothing, a vast emptiness that somehow contained the entirety of existence. She floated in that space between worlds, feeling her mortal body grow cold and still below, while her consciousness drifted free, untethered from flesh and bone. She saw her life spread before her like a tapestry, every patient healed, every hand held as someone passed from this world to the next, every moment of loneliness and longing for the children she could never have. She saw the curse that had defined her, understood finally that it had never been punishment but preparation, shaping her into someone who could make the choice she had just made. And then, from somewhere beyond the void, she heard Lucan's voice calling her back. The return to her body was violent, consciousness slammed back into dead flesh like lightning striking earth, and Aelia's eyes flew open as she gasped, not for air, because her lungs no longer needed it, but from the sheer shock of being once again contained in physical form. Every sense exploded into overwhelming intensity. She could hear conversations happening streets away, could smell the smoke from Rome's burning temples mixing with the scent of Lucan's ancient blood, could feel every texture of the stone beneath her with crystalline clarity. And the hunger, gods, the hunger. It rose in her like a tidal wave, primal and consuming, a need so fundamental it made her previous mortal desires seem like pale shadows. She needed blood, needed the warmth and life of it, needed to feed, needed it with every fiber of her reborn being. Easy. Lucan's voice cut through the madness. His hand pressed firmly against her chest, holding her down as she tried to rise. The hunger will pass. Breathe, not because you need to, but because it helps you focus. Breathe and listen to my voice. Aelia forced herself to obey, drawing air into lungs that no longer required it, finding that the familiar action did indeed help center her thoughts. Slowly, the overwhelming hunger receded to something manageable, still present but no longer all-consuming. How long? She asked, and was startled by her own voice. It sounded the same, yet somehow different, carrying an edge it had never possessed before. 3 hours since you drank my blood, Lucan replied, helping her sit up. Your transformation was faster than most. Usually it takes until dawn, but you fought your way back quickly, strong-willed even in death. Aelia looked at her hands in the lamplight and saw they were pale as marble, all warmth leached from the skin. The arrow wound in her chest was completely healed, not even a scar remaining. When she pressed her hand to her chest, she felt nothing, no heartbeat, no pulse of life. She was dead and yet more alive than she had ever been. The sun, she said suddenly, remembering. What hour is it? How long until dawn? 3 hours still, Lucan assured her. We have time, but we should move soon. The riots continue above, and while fire cannot harm us now, collapsing buildings certainly can. He paused, studying her face. How do you feel? Like I died and came back wrong, Aelia said honestly. Then, after a moment, and like I died and came back exactly right. Both things at once. Lucan smiled. That is immortality in a sentence. You will spend eternity feeling both. They emerged from the catacombs into a Rome transformed by chaos. Fires burned across multiple hills, painting the night sky orange and red. The mob had dispersed into smaller groups, some still rioting, others looting abandoned homes, still others simply standing in shock at what they had unleashed. Bodies lay in the streets, victims of violence or trampling or the simple bad luck of being in the wrong place when rage exploded into action, and Aelia could smell them all. Every drop of spilled blood called to her, sang to the hunger that still lurked in her chest. Her fangs descended without conscious thought, and she found herself starting toward the nearest corpse before Lucan's hand on her arm stopped her. Not yet, he said quietly. First, I teach you control. The blood of the dead will satisfy the basic hunger, but feeding is about more than simply consuming. It is about choosing when and how and from whom. It is about retaining your humanity, even as you do something fundamentally inhuman. He led her away from the bodies, through streets she had walked 1,000 times, but which now seemed entirely new. Every sense heightened until she felt drunk on sensation. They passed the temple of Asclepius, or what remained of it. The building was a burnt shell, roof collapsed, columns blackened by smoke. Everything she had worked for, destroyed in a single night of fury. "Your patients?" she asked, stopping to stare at the ruins. "Marcus got most of them out," Lucan replied. "I saw them fleeing into the Christian catacombs before I carried you below. Some may have died in the chaos, but most will survive." He looked at her carefully. "Does it hurt, seeing your life's work destroyed?" Elia considered the question, examining her own feelings with the same clinical precision she had once used to diagnose illness. "No," she said finally, surprised by her own answer. "Or yes, but distantly, as if it happened to someone else. Is that wrong?" "It is natural," Lucan said. "You are no longer the woman who tended those patients. That woman died 3 hours ago. You carry her memories, her knowledge, her experiences, but you are something new now. The emotions that drove her, duty, compassion, the need to heal because you could not create, those will feel different now. Muted, changed." "But you said we could still do good," Aelia protested. "You said we could help mortals, that we could transform the curse into something with purpose." "And we can," Lucan assured her. "But it will be different. You will help them not because you feel compelled by mortal empathy, but because you choose to, because you remember what it meant to be human and want to honor that memory. It is a more deliberate kindness, perhaps, but no less real." They reached the Palatine Hill and descended into the ruined palace where Lucan's tomb waited. There, in the chamber lit only by the blood-red moon shining through the collapsed roof, he began to teach her the rules of her new existence. "First, the sun," he said. "At dawn, you will feel it calling you to sleep. Do not fight it. The day sleep is not optional, not for the newly turned. In time, with centuries of practice, you may learn to resist it for short periods. But for now, when the sun rises, you must be in darkness or you will burn. Second, the hunger. It will never fully leave you. Every night you will wake to it, and every night you must find a way to feed. The blood of the dead suffices for survival, but the blood of the living grants strength, speed, heightened senses. You will need to decide which you prefer, safety or power. Third, the rules I have made for myself. I do not kill the innocent. I do not feed from children. I do not create other immortals without consent. These rules are my choice, not laws that bind all of our kind, but I recommend them if you wish to retain your humanity." Aelia listened, committing every word to memory with the perfect recall her transformation had granted. "What about my healing?" she asked. "You said I would lose the ability. Is it completely gone?" Lucan hesitated. "Touch the wall," he instructed. "Place your palm flat against the stone and tell me what you feel." Aelia obeyed, pressing her hand to the ancient stone of the palace wall. For a moment she felt nothing unusual, just cold rock beneath her palm. Then, slowly, she began to perceive something else. A warmth, faint but distinct, as if life still lingered in the stone itself. Not the life of flesh and blood, but something older, deeper, the life of earth and time and endurance. "I feel," she struggled to find words, "like the stone is alive. Not as we understand life, but as if everything carries some spark of existence." "That is your healer's gift transformed," Lucan explained. "You cannot mend flesh as you once did. Your touch is cold now, dead, unable to channel the warmth that healing requires. But you can sense life in all its forms, can perceive the threads that connect all living things. It is a different kind of knowledge, but knowledge nonetheless." He moved to stand beside her, and suddenly Aelia could feel it, the connection between them, a thread of blood and choice that bound them together. Through it she could sense his emotions, muted but present, hope, fear, loneliness held at bay by her presence, and beneath it all, a desperate wish that he had finally found what he had been seeking for 7 centuries. "We are bound," she whispered, "not just by the blood you gave me, but by something deeper." "Yes," Lucan confirmed, "the maker and the made, linked until one of us finds true death. I will always know where you are, will always feel if you are in danger, and you will sense the same from me. We are no longer solitary creatures, Aelia. We are a pair, and that changes everything." Dawn approached, and they felt it simultaneously, a pulling sensation, as if invisible chains were dragging them toward sleep. Lucan opened his sarcophagus, revealing the ancient silk cushions within, then gestured to a second sarcophagus he had prepared days ago, anticipating this moment. "Your first day sleep. he said. "It will feel like death again, like surrendering consciousness completely. But you will wake at sunset, and I will be here. You will never face the darkness alone." Alia looked at the stone coffin that would be her bed for however many centuries lay ahead. Then she looked at Lucan, at the impossible creature who had offered her a choice when the gods had offered only curses, who had transformed her death into a strange and terrible rebirth. "Thank you," she said simply. Lucan's expression softened. "Thank me in a century," he replied, "when you know what eternity truly costs. But for now, rest, Alia. Let the sun rise without you. Tomorrow night, we begin teaching you how to live in the darkness." She climbed into the sarcophagus, feeling the ancient stone cold against her equally cold flesh. As the lid closed and darkness enveloped her, as the day sleep pulled her down into dreamless unconsciousness, Alia's last thought was that she had spent 30 years unable to create life, and in a single night of blood and death and transformation, she had finally found a way to become something new. Not mother, but something else entirely, something eternal. 3 centuries passed like water through open fingers. Alia watched Rome fall, saw the great empire that had seemed eternal crumble beneath the weight of its own ambitions and the press of barbarian tribes from the north. She and Lucan walked through the ruins as Gothic warriors sacked the eternal city, as temples were desecrated and palaces burned. They saved who they could, dragging families from burning buildings, guiding refugees to safety through secret paths only immortals remembered. The Christians, growing in power, called it divine judgment. Alia, who had walked with gods and monsters both, called it simply the inevitable entropy of all mortal works. They traveled after Rome's fall, moving through the transforming world as empires rose and fell like waves upon a shore. They walked through Constantinople when it shone as the new Rome, through the courts of Charlemagne, through the plague-ravaged streets of medieval Europe, where Alia's transformed healer's sense proved invaluable in understanding the pestilence that mortals could not comprehend. Everywhere they went, they did the same thing. They saved the dying, protected the vulnerable, used their immortal strength and knowledge to preserve what they could of humanity's struggling light. They did not do it for gratitude or recognition. They did it because Alia remembered what it meant to heal, and Lucan remembered what it meant to rule justly, and together they had decided that their curse would be transformed into purpose. But it was Alia who discovered the true scope of what they could become. It happened in a small village in what would someday be called France, during a winter so harsh that children froze in their beds. A woman came to them. They were posing as traveling nobles, wealthy enough to help but not so prominent as to draw dangerous attention. She came with a child in her arms, a girl no more than 5 years old, dying of pneumonia, her small chest barely rising with each labored breath. "Please," the woman begged. "The priests say only a miracle can save her. I have nothing to offer, but please, she is all I have left." Alia looked at the dying child and felt something shift inside her. She could not heal as she once had. Her touch was cold, lifeless, unable to channel the warmth that mending flesh required. But she had learned over 3 centuries that her transformed gift allowed her to sense the threads of life, to perceive the patterns of existence that mortals could not see. She placed her hand on the child's forehead and reached with that inner sense, following the threads of life that were unraveling, seeing where the sickness had taken hold. Then, with a precision that defied mortality, she spoke to Lucan through their bond. "Give me your wrist." He obeyed without question, having learned over centuries to trust her instincts. Alia took a single drop of his blood, just one, not enough to transform, but enough to carry the immortal vitality that sustained them, and placed it on the child's lips. The effect was immediate. Color returned to the girl's cheeks. Her breathing eased. The fever broke. Within minutes, she was sleeping peacefully. The crisis passed. The mother wept with joy, calling it a miracle, never knowing that the nobles who had saved her daughter were creatures of darkness who had learned to transform their curse into blessing. After that, Alia understood. She could not heal as she once had, but she could do something perhaps greater. She could share the smallest fraction of their immortal essence, enough to tip the balance when mortal medicine failed, enough to save those who stood at death's threshold. Word spread, as it always does. The nobles who performed miracles, the mysterious healers who came in the night and left behind lives saved. Stories grew into legends, legends into myths. Some called them angels, others demons. The church investigated, finding nothing. Alia and Lucan were always gone before official notice arrived, moving on to the next village, the next plague, the next disaster where their intervention might preserve life. And slowly, over centuries, Alia realized what she had become. Not a mother in the traditional sense. She still could not bear children, still carried that fundamental curse. But she had become mother to nations, guardian to countless souls, preserver of bloodlines that would otherwise have ended. Every child she saved grew to have children of their own, and those children had children, until her influence spread through humanity like roots through soil. She mentioned this to Lucan one night as they stood on a hillside overlooking a village they had just saved from raiders. "I cannot create life," she said, "but I have preserved so much of it. Thousands of lives, maybe tens of thousands over the centuries. Is that not its own form of motherhood?" Lucan smiled, the expression warm despite his cold flesh. "You have become exactly what I hoped you would," he said. "When I offered you eternity, I saw in you the potential to transform darkness into light. You have exceeded even my greatest expectations." "We have," Alia corrected. "This is not my work alone. Your strength protects the vulnerable. Your wealth provides for the desperate. Your knowledge guides us to where we are most needed. We do this together." "Together," Lucan agreed, taking her hand. "As we have for 3 centuries, as we will for 3,000 more, if the gods allow." They continued their work as years became decades, decades became centuries. They walked through the Renaissance and marveled at humanity's capacity for beauty. They endured the religious wars and wept at humanity's capacity for cruelty. They witnessed revolutions and plagues, discoveries and disasters, the endless cycle of mortal existence. And always, they intervened where they could. A drop of blood here to save a dying scholar whose work would change the world. A word of warning there to prevent a massacre. Wealth distributed to fund hospitals, orphanages, schools. They became legends whispered around fires. The eternal guardians, the shadow healers, the immortal protectors. Centuries later, historians would puzzle over recurring figures in medieval records, Renaissance accounts, Enlightenment documents. 2 mysterious nobles who appeared during crises, helped, then vanished. Some dismissed these accounts as myth. Others saw patterns suggesting something extraordinary. But by then, Alia and Lucan had perfected the art of remaining hidden while staying present, shadows that preserved the light. On a night when the moon rose red over ruins that had once been Rome, now buried under layers of history, rebuilt and fallen and rebuilt again, 2 figures walked hand in hand through ancient streets only they remembered. One had been an emperor who learned that true power lay in service. The other had been a healer who learned that motherhood took infinite forms. "Do you regret it?" Lucan asked, as he had asked every century. "The choice you made that night when Rome burned?" Alia looked at him, at the companion who had walked beside her through centuries of darkness and light, who had transformed her curse into purpose, who had shown her that eternity was not punishment but opportunity. "Never," she said, the same answer she had given every time. "I cannot bear children, but I have borne your eternity, and together we have mothered nations. What greater purpose could the gods have intended?" They continued walking, 2 immortal souls in a mortal world, their shadows stretching long behind them in the moonlight. And in their wake, invisible but undeniable, stretched the threads of countless lives saved, bloodlines preserved, futures secured, a legacy not of blood and birth, but of choice and compassion, and the transformation of darkness into light. The mother of eternity and the emperor of shadows, walking hand in hand through the ages, proving that even the cruelest curse could become the greatest blessing if borne with love.